In the fading light of a cold autumn afternoon, silhouetted against the darkening sky stood the abandoned Blackwood Orphanage. Once grand and imposing, its Victorian architecture now crumbled under decades of neglect. Through broken windows, the wind whispered, carrying tales long forgotten by the world outside. My name is Dr. Eleanor Pierce. Specializing in post-war institutional history as a historical archivist, I've documented dozens of abandoned facilities across New England, but none would leave a mark on my soul quite like Blackwood. When I first received the assignment to catalog the remaining artifacts before the building's scheduled demolition, I approached it with the same clinical detachment I'd maintained throughout my career. A thorough documentation of the orphanage was wanted by the local historical society. It had housed hundreds of children between 1878 and its abrupt closure in 1952. A stern but unremarkable institution was shown in the county record photographs, one of many that dotted the landscape in an era before modern foster care systems. On paper, Blackwood Orphanage appeared to be nothing more than a footnote in regional history. How terribly wrong I was. Upon arrival, the first thing that struck me was the silence. A particular ambience is held by most abandoned buildings, the creak of settling foundations, the scurrying of small animals that have made homes in forgotten corners. But sound seemed to be absorbed by Blackwood, creating a vacuum that pressed against my eardrums like the pressure before a storm. Hints of its former grandeur were retained by the main entrance hall. Upward swept a wide staircase, its mahogany banister now warped and splintered. Lining the walls were faded portraits of stern-faced administrators, their eyes seeming to follow my movements through layers of dust and cobwebs. My assistant, James, said, consulting the building plans, the administrative offices should be through here. In the dense air of the foyer, his voice sounded strangely muffled. Most of the documentation was removed decades ago, but the Historical Society believes some records might remain in the private office of the last headmistress. We made our way down a long corridor, our flashlights creating dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. Since the 1970s, the orphanage had been without electricity, when the county ceased maintaining the property. Barely penetrating the grime-covered windows was the late October sunlight, casting everything in a sepia tone that felt like moving through an old photograph. At the end of the east wing was the headmistress's office, separated from the children's dormitories and common areas. Even in decay, authority and isolation were conveyed by it. A heavy oak door, still intact despite the years, bore a simple brass plaque, Headmistress Agatha Blackwood. Blackwood, I murmured. The same name as the orphanage. The building was originally the Blackwood family estate, James nodded. After the Civil War, Agatha converted it to an orphanage, left a generation of children parentless. She ran it until her death in 1915 when her daughter Margaret took over. Margaret's daughter, Constance, was the final headmistress until its closure. 3 generations of Blackwood women, I said. Interesting. With surprising ease, the door swung open, as if recently oiled. Remarkably intact compared to the rest of the building was the office beyond. Dominating the space was a massive desk, flanked by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Behind the desk hung a portrait, a severe-looking woman with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to pierce through the canvas. Constance Blackwood, I presume, I said, approaching the portrait. A sensation I dismissed as the natural discomfort of being watched, even by a painting, made me uneasy about something in her gaze. She doesn't look like someone who enjoyed running an orphanage, James observed. Few did in those days, I replied, turning my attention to the desk. Orphanages weren't about nurturing children so much as containing society's unwanted. Locked were the desk drawers, but the old mechanisms gave way easily to my specialized tools. Inside, we found the expected administrative detritus, ledgers documenting expenses, correspondence with local officials, and donation records from the town's wealthier families. Nothing unusual until we reached the bottom drawer. Smaller than the others, it was secured with a separate lock of noticeably higher quality. When it finally opened, a single item was found inside, a leather-bound journal. Unmarked was its cover except for a strange symbol embossed on the spine, a tree with roots that twisted into what appeared to be a face. The Blackwood family crest, perhaps, James suggested. Carefully, I lifted the journal, noting its surprising weight and the quality of the leather binding. "This isn't a standard administrative record," I said. "This is personal." From between the pages, something fluttered, a black and white photograph. It showed a group of children arranged in rows before the orphanage, their expressions uniformly solemn. Behind them stood 3 women in dark dresses, their posture rigid and uninviting. But what caught my attention was a detail in the background, a small face in one of the basement windows, blurred but distinctly present despite all the children being accounted for in the formal arrangement. "James, look at this," I said, pointing to the anomaly. Leaning in, he squinted. "Could be a smudge on the negative, maybe, but I wasn't convinced." Over, I turned the photograph. Written in faded ink was a date, October 31st, 1951, and a brief notation, "Final harvest before the winter." An odd choice of words for an orphanage photograph. Careful not to damage the brittle pages, I opened the journal. Precise and measured was the handwriting, the work of someone educated and disciplined. The first entry was dated January 15, 1951. "The children are restless this winter. The new arrivals from the Carson fire have disrupted the careful balance I've maintained. Especially troubling is the Parker girl with her questions and watchful eyes. I've instructed Mrs. Winters to assign her additional cleaning duties in the far corridors. Exhaustion breeds compliance." I frowned. Colder than I'd expected was the tone, even for an institution of that era. Forward several pages, I flipped. March 4, 1951. "Another disappearance has been noted by that meddling social worker, Mr. Holloway." I explained, as I have before, that runaways are an unfortunate reality in our line of work. Children, especially the older ones, often seek independence prematurely. He seemed unconvinced, but without evidence, his concerns remain merely speculative. The basement chamber requires additional soundproofing before the next ceremony. I've commissioned work under the guise of boiler repairs. Cold ran my blood. "What is it?" he asked, noticing my expression. I hesitated, then read the entry aloud. In the air between us, the implications hung. It could be innocuous, he offered, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe ceremony refers to some kind of institutional tradition. Maybe, I conceded. But I was already turning pages, searching for clarification. The daily operations of the orphanage were documented in the entries through spring and summer, interspersed with cryptic references to preparations and the legacy. Frequently mentioned by Constance were conflicts with staff members who asked too many questions, followed by turns about their resignations or, in some cases, unfortunate accidents. Then came an entry that stopped my breath. September 15, 1951. The alignment approaches. Grandmother's manuscripts confirm that this year's convergence will be the strongest in a century. The chamber is prepared, and I've selected the vessels carefully. The Parker girl continues to present problems, inciting questions among the others. Today, I found her in the East Wing archive reading grandmother's journals. She will be the first. "James," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to look at the basement." He hesitated. "Eleanor, it's getting late. Maybe we should come back tomorrow with more people." "The demolition crew arrives in 3 days," I reminded him. "Whatever happened here has been hidden for over 70 years. I'm not leaving until I understand what Constance Blackwood was writing about." Located off the kitchen was the basement access. A massive iron door stood in stark contrast to the wooden doors throughout the rest of the building. It took both of us to pull it open, the hinges groaning in protest as if warning us away. Into darkness so complete it seemed to devour our flashlight beams descended stone steps. Damp and carrying a peculiar scent was the air that rushed up to meet us. Not the expected mustiness of an old cellar, but something sharper, metallic. "Wait," James said, reaching into his bag. I brought emergency lanterns. The batteries last longer. A sterile blue-white glow was cast by the LED lanterns that somehow made the basement more alien rather than more visible. Carefully, we descended. The stone steps were slick with moisture of uncertain origin. Unexpectedly vast was the basement level, extending well beyond the footprint of the building above. Rough stone walls gave way to earthen passages reinforced with timber, reminiscent of mine shafts more than an institutional cellar. "This doesn't make sense architecturally," James murmured, consulting the building plans again. "These tunnels aren't documented anywhere." We followed the main passage, noting smaller offshoot tunnels that had collapsed or been deliberately sealed with brick and mortar. Noticeably, the temperature dropped as we ventured deeper, our breath forming clouds in the beam of the lanterns. After what seemed like 100 yards, we encountered another door. This one was made of dense metal with unusual inscriptions etched into its surface. Unlike the basement entrance, this door was secured with a complex locking mechanism that appeared remarkably well maintained. "Those aren't standard symbols," James observed, pointing to the inscriptions. "They look almost like the same symbol from the journal," I finished, recognizing the twisted tree root face motif repeated around the door's edge. This is what she called the chamber. Despite its complexity, the lock surrendered to my tools after several tense minutes. With unexpected ease, the door swung inward, as if the hinges had been recently tended. All expectations were defied by the chamber beyond. It was perfectly circular, the walls lined with polished black stone unlike anything in the surrounding structure. Upward arched the ceiling, creating a dome etched with astronomical symbols and constellations. But it was the floor that drew our horrified attention. A circular depression dominated the center, surrounded by 7 stone platforms arranged like points on a compass. Manacles sized for children's wrists and ankles were borne by each platform. Cut into the stone were channels, all leading to the central depression. "Oh my God," James whispered, his voice cracking. Details that turned my stomach were revealed by our lanterns. The walls were covered in handwritten text, names, dates, and notations about suitability and yield. Children's names, hundreds of them, spanning decades. "Eleanor," James called, his voice coming from an alcove I hadn't noticed. "There's another journal here, and records." A stone pedestal supporting another leather-bound book, identical to the one we'd found in the office but larger, was contained in the alcove. Surrounding it were filing cabinets that seemed jarringly modern compared to the ancient atmosphere of the chamber. Detailed accounts of what Constance Blackwood called ceremonies were contained in the journal, rituals performed on specific astronomical alignments using orphaned children as vessels for something she referred to only as the feeding. The earliest entries were written by Agatha in the 1880s, continued by Margaret, and concluded with Constance's precise, dispassionate documentation. Individual records of children were held in the filing cabinets, intake forms paired with ceremonial, yield assessments, and vessel quality ratings, clinical language describing unspeakable acts recorded with the detached precision of scientists documenting experiments. 3 generations, I said numbly. They were doing this for 3 generations. Pale was James, his hands shaking as he replaced a folder. But what stopped them? Why did the orphanage close in 1952? In the final pages of the chamber journal lay the answer. As I read Constance's last entries, a different story emerged, one of resistance and unexpected courage. October 29, 1951. The Parker girl has become a significant liability. After discovering her in the archives, I administered a sedative and brought her to the preparation room, but she had anticipated this and taken precautions. Somehow, she managed to smuggle my office keys from my desk and had already made copies of selected journal pages. Before I could begin the preparation ritual, she revealed that she had distributed these copies to 3 other children with instructions to deliver them to authorities should she disappear. Her impudence was remarkable. She looked me in the eye, a child of 12, and said, "I know what happens in the basement, Miss Blackwood. I know about your grandmother and mother. I know what you are." Such composure in one so young. It would have made her an exceptional vessel. I've been forced to release her to the dormitory while I assess the situation. The alignment is in 2 days. I cannot afford interference. I turned the page, my heart racing. October 30th, 1951. Disaster. The Parker girl and her co-conspirators, whose identities remain unknown to me, have somehow contacted that persistent social worker, Holloway. He arrived unannounced this morning with local police demanding access to the entire facility, including the basement. I denied their request, citing the children's privacy and institutional regulations. Holloway produced a court order. More alarmingly, he had specific pages from grandmother's original journal. The very pages describing the chamber's construction and purpose. The police have given me 24 hours to prepare the children for inspection and interviews. The alignment is tomorrow night. Everything has been prepared. The vessels are selected. The feeding must occur. The legacy cannot end with me. Asterisk. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1951, the same date as the photograph. They are coming at sunset. The children are agitated, whispering among themselves. The Parker girl watches me from across the dining hall with undisguised triumph in her eyes. Such a waste of potential. I've made necessary arrangements. The selected vessels are secured in the chamber. Mrs. Winters, the only staff member who understands the importance of our work, is completing the preparatory rites. The legacy will continue, even if I cannot. I've sealed grandmother's original manuscripts and artifacts in the hidden compartment beneath the office. Future descendants will find them when the time is right. The hunger is eternal. It merely waits. Should the authorities breach the chamber before the ceremony completes, I've prepared contingencies. The Blackwood legacy will not face public scrutiny or mundane justice. The hour approaches. I hear vehicles on the gravel drive. May those who come after understand the necessity of our work. There, the journal ended. Unspecified remained whatever contingencies Constance had planned. The orphanage closed the next day, James said, consulting his research notes. November 1st, 1951. There was no public explanation, just a sudden transfer of all remaining children to other facilities across the state. And no mention of arrests or charges against Constance Blackwood or this Mrs. Winters, I added. We need to check the local newspaper archives. As if in response to my words, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels, the unmistakable creak of the basement door opening above. Is someone else supposed to be here? James whispered, instinctively lowering his lantern. I shook my head. The Historical Society said we'd be the only ones until the demolition crew arrives. We stood frozen, listening. Multiple sets of footsteps moved deliberately across the basement floor above. Not the cautious steps of trespassers, but the confident stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. We need to leave, I said, gathering the journal and several folders of the most detailed records. Now. James nodded, shoving documents into his bag. As we moved toward the chamber door, something we'd overlooked was caught by our lantern light, a small wooden door built into the wall behind the pedestal, nearly invisible against the black stone. Another passage, James whispered. The footsteps above were drawing closer to the tunnel entrance. With no time to deliberate, I pulled the small door open, revealing a narrow passage that seemed to slope upward. It might lead outside, I said, or at least away from whoever's coming. We squeezed through the opening, finding ourselves in a tight earthen tunnel reinforced with ancient timbers. Stale but flowing was the air, suggesting it connected to the surface somewhere ahead. We doused our lanterns, navigating by touch along the rough walls, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind us. After several minutes of claustrophobic crawling, the passage widened enough for us to stand. Ahead appeared a faint glow. Not daylight, but artificial illumination. Another small wooden door terminated the tunnel. Beyond it, we could hear the hum of electrical equipment and muffled voices. Against the wood, I pressed my ear, trying to discern words. Be completed before the demolition. A woman's voice was saying. The chamber artifacts must be relocated to the new facility and the journals, secured, a man responded. Although I'm concerned about the office journal, it wasn't in the drawer where records indicated. Could the archivists have found it? A pause. Possible. The Pierce woman has a reputation for thoroughness. Her presence here is unfortunate timing. From the door, I pulled back, my blood turning to ice. They knew my name. Whoever was on the other side knew exactly who I was and why I was here. We need to find another way out, I whispered to James. As we turned to retreat, the wooden door swung open, flooding the tunnel with harsh fluorescent light. Silhouetted in the doorway stood an elderly woman in an impeccably tailored suit, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated sharp features hauntingly similar to the portrait of Constance Blackwood. Dr. Pierce, she said, her voice matching the one we'd overheard. How disappointing. We expected better security protocols from someone with your credentials. Behind her, I glimpsed a modern facility, computer equipment, climate-controlled storage units, and walls lined with familiar leather-bound journals. Who are you? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Thinly, the woman smiled. A custodian of history, like yourself. Though I serve a more specific historical legacy. She stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. Please, since you've come this far, we might as well have a proper conversation. Having no viable alternative, we stepped into what appeared to be a state-of-the-art research facility built into the hillside adjacent to the orphanage. Men and women in lab coats moved purposefully among workstations, cataloging artifacts and digitizing documents. Welcome to the Blackwood Historical Preservation Project, the woman said. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood. Constance was my grandmother. My mind reeled. That's impossible. The records show Constance Blackwood died without heirs in 1972. Official records show many convenient untruths, Elizabeth replied. Just as the official history of Blackwood Orphanage omits its most significant contributions. She led us to a conference room walled with glass, offering a view of the larger facility. On entering, she pressed a button that clouded the glass, ensuring privacy. You've read the journals, she stated. Not a question. Enough to understand what happened here, I answered, fighting to maintain professional composure. You're preserving evidence of generational child murder. Elizabeth's expression didn't change. A reductive interpretation, but understandable given your limited context. Please, sit. We remained standing. What happened to the children in the chamber? James asked. The ones Constance mentioned in her final entry. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossed Elizabeth's face. Rescued, Mr. Chen. When the authorities arrived on October 31, 1951, they found 7 children restrained in the chamber. All survived, though the psychological trauma proved challenging for them. And Constance? Mrs. Winters? I pressed. Gone by the time police breached the chamber. A passage similar to the one you discovered allowed their escape. She gestured to the facility around us. The Blackwood legacy continued, though in a necessarily evolved form. What legacy? I demanded. Those journals described torture and murder spanning decades. What possible justification? Protection, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice hardening. What my ancestors did was protecting humanity, Dr. Pierce. The methods were regrettable but necessary for their time. She moved to a cabinet and removed a folder, sliding it across the table toward us. Inside were newspaper clippings from the 1950s through the present, accounts of disasters, unusual phenomena, and unexplained deaths, all centered around astronomical events matching the alignments mentioned in the journals. Each of these incidents occurred during convergences when no ceremony was performed, Elizabeth explained. The feeding must happen, Dr. Pierce. If not through directed ritual, then through chaotic manifestation. You're saying without your family's ceremonies, these disasters happen naturally? James asked, skepticism evident. Nothing natural about it, Elizabeth corrected. But yes, the hunger finds satisfaction one way or another. My grandmother's contingency plan in 1951 was to allow precisely this, to let the consequences of interruption become self-evident. I shook my head, unwilling to accept her implication. So, you're continuing these practices? Finding vessels for your ceremonies? Unexpected was Elizabeth's laugh. We're not monsters, Dr. Pierce. Science has progressed considerably since my grandmother's time. The Blackwood Preservation Project developed synthetic alternatives in the 1980s. No human vessels required, just precisely calibrated energetic substitutes. She pressed another button, and a portion of the wall slid away to reveal a laboratory. Inside, technicians attended to equipment surrounding a smaller version of the chamber we discovered below the orphanage. At its center, instead of restraints for children, stood a complex apparatus humming with energy. The hunger remains constant, Elizabeth continued. But our methods have evolved. We contain and redirect rather than sacrifice. The legacy continues, but adapted to modern ethical standards. Why maintain the original site? I asked. Why not destroy the evidence of what happened there? Historical continuity, she replied without hesitation. The original chamber has properties that resist relocation. We've been preparing for years to transfer those properties to our new facility before demolition. Your arrival accelerated our timeline. She closed the folder and regarded us carefully. So now we face a dilemma. You possess knowledge that could disrupt our work. Work that prevents the very disasters documented in these files. Yet you understandably find our historical methods abhorrent. Those children, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Hundreds of them over decades. They deserved justice. They deserved better. Elizabeth agreed, surprising me. The past cannot be undone, Dr. Pierce. But the future can be protected. That's our focus now. A heavy silence fell over the room as I processed her words. The evidence in my bag, the journal, the records, could expose both historical atrocities and this continuing operation. Whatever its current methods, the Blackwood legacy had begun in unspeakable cruelty. Elizabeth seemed to read my thoughts. You're considering exposure. Understandable. Before you decide, I'd like you to meet someone. She pressed an intercom button. Please ask Miss Parker to join us. The name hit me like a physical blow. Parker. The girl from the journal? Elizabeth nodded. Sarah Parker. The 12-year-old who brought down Blackwood Orphanage in 1951. She's 86 now, and she's been an integral part of our ethics oversight since 1972. The door opened to admit an elderly woman with bright, alert eyes and a dignified bearing that belied her age. She walked with a cane, but moved with purpose, surveying James and me with evident interest. The historians who found Constance's journal, she said, her voice stronger than her frame suggested. I wondered if someone would eventually. Miss Parker, you claimed you were held captive in that basement, I said, watching for her reaction. That you were meant to be a vessel for some kind of ritual sacrifice. Sarah Parker's expression remained composed. Not claims, Dr. Pierce. Facts. I was strapped to one of those stone platforms on 3 separate occasions before my final confrontation with Constance. I watched other children taken below who never returned. I lived that nightmare. Then how can you work with? James began. Because I understand what happens when the feeding is denied, she interrupted sharply. I've witnessed the alternatives. After my rescue, I spent 20 years investigating, documenting patterns of disaster and death that followed astronomical alignments. The hunger is real, Dr. Pierce. Whatever you choose to call it, entity, force, cosmic parasite, it exists and it consumes. Carefully, she lowered herself into a chair. When Elizabeth's mother approached me in 1972 with evidence of their synthetic containment system, I agreed to help on one condition, that no child, no human being would ever be used again. I've overseen that promise for 50 years. The conviction in her voice was undeniable. This woman, once the child who had exposed unimaginable horror, now defended its evolved continuation. The original chamber will be decommissioned tomorrow, Elizabeth said. Its essential properties transferred to our new facility. The demolition will proceed as scheduled, burying the physical evidence of my family's earliest methods. The question is whether you will allow this transition to complete, or expose a historical horror at the cost of future protection. I looked at the journals in my bag, then at Sarah Parker, trying to reconcile the enormity of what I discovered with the complexity of its present form. I need proof, I said finally. Not just your word that these disasters are connected to your hunger. Not just newspaper clippings that could be coincidental. Sarah nodded, as if she'd expected this. That's fair. I said the same in 1972. She turned to Elizabeth. Show them the November simulation. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. She accessed a computer terminal and brought up a complex model on the wall screen, a simulation of energy patterns across North America focused on a small town in Maine. This models the upcoming alignment on November 17th, she explained. Without containment, the energy convergence would manifest here at these coordinates. The simulation showed a cascading failure of systems, structural collapses, electrical grid disruption, and a steadily expanding circle of affected area. Population of the initial impact zone, approximately 4,300, Elizabeth continued clinically. Secondary effects would potentially impact another 15,000 in surrounding communities. And with your containment system? James asked quietly. Elizabeth adjusted the parameters, and the simulation changed dramatically. The energy patterns redirected to the facility we now stood in, contained within the synthetic chamber, and gradually neutralized. Validation data, Sarah added, retrieving a thick binder from a nearby shelf. 50 years of predictive models matched against actual events when containment succeeded or failed. Independent analysis by physicists, statisticians, and disaster response experts, all working with anonymized data. Of course, I spent the next hour examining their evidence, looking for flaws or deceptions. What I found instead was a meticulously documented phenomenon that defied conventional explanation, but yielded to consistent measurement and intervention. As the sun set beyond the hills surrounding Blackwood Orphanage, I reached a decision I never could have anticipated that morning. The original records, I said, removing the journal and folders from my bag. They belong in a secure archive, not destroyed. The children who died deserve to be remembered, even if their names are never publicly connected to what happened here. Elizabeth and Sarah exchanged glances. That's acceptable, Elizabeth said carefully. We maintain comprehensive archives of all Blackwood operations, including the original ceremonial period. The records would remain accessible to qualified researchers under appropriate confidentiality agreements. And your current operation, this synthetic containment, needs independent oversight beyond Ms. Parker, I continued. Regular ethical review by experts who understand both the historical context and the stakes. Also acceptable within security parameters, Elizabeth agreed. We've actually proposed similar measures internally. With something approaching approval, Sarah Parker regarded me. You're not suggesting exposure. I'm suggesting accountability, I clarified. The past can't be changed, but it can inform how we monitor the present. In the days that followed, I witnessed the decommissioning of the original chamber and the transfer of its properties, a process involving equipment that measured energy patterns I barely understood. The demolition proceeded on schedule, burying the physical evidence of decades of atrocity beneath tons of rubble. But the records survived, catalogued and preserved in climate-controlled archives beneath the new Blackwood facility. Each child's name, each ceremony documented and acknowledged in a historical record that would never see public light, but would never be erased. I accepted a position as historical ethics consultant to the Blackwood Preservation Project, a role that gives me access to their operations while maintaining my primary career as an archivist. James declined further involvement, preferring to distance himself from discoveries that still haunt his dreams. Sometimes in the quiet hours of early morning, I question my decision. The evidence in my possession could have exposed historical crimes of unimaginable proportion. But would justice for long-dead victims justify the potential consequences that Sarah Parker and Elizabeth Blackwood so convincingly demonstrated? The hunger, as they call it, continues its cyclical demands. The containment systems hum with energy on specific astronomical alignments, drawing in forces that would otherwise manifest as natural disasters. The legacy continues, evolved but unbroken. And I continue documenting, preserving the truth of what happened at Blackwood Orphanage while helping ensure it never happens again. The basement held macabre secrets that a single diary began to reveal, but the full story I've learned is both darker and more complex than I could have imagined. The past is written in the blood of innocent children. The present is written in synthetic compounds and ethical oversight committees. And the future? The future depends on remembering both while ensuring they remain distinct. As I write these final notes, I'm looking at a photograph. Not the formal arrangement of solemn children from 1951, but a more recent image. It shows the demolition of Blackwood Orphanage, the Victorian structure collapsed into dust and memory. In the background, barely visible unless you know to look for it, stands a small figure watching from the tree-line, probably a member of the demolition crew or a local resident curious about the commotion. But sometimes when the wind howls outside my window at night, I wonder if the hunger Elizabeth contains is truly the only legacy of Blackwood Orphanage. If perhaps some echoes refuse containment, lingering at the edges of perception. The diary described torture and death. The chamber confirmed it. But some questions remain unanswered, some doors unopened. And perhaps that's for the best. After all, as Constance Blackwood wrote in her final entry, the hunger is eternal. It merely waits. And so do I, watching for signs that the containment might falter, that history might threaten to repeat itself. Because while the orphanage is gone, its shadow remains, in records, in memories, and in the quiet vigilance of those who know what waited in the basement. The macabre torture hidden beneath Blackwood Orphanage has ended. But the diary that described it all, that continues to speak to those willing to listen. And I, for better or worse, am listening still. Blackwood Orphanage was demolished on November 3, 2022. The Blackwood Historical Preservation Project continues its work at an undisclosed location. This account is compiled from personal records, recovered documents, and first-hand observations. For those who recognize certain patterns in disaster reports or astronomical alignments, you're not alone. For those who bear names found in orphanage records from institutions long closed, your history may be more complex than you know. And for anyone who might discover a leather-bound journal bearing a strange embossed symbol of a tree with roots that twist into a face, close it, secure it, and contact the Historical Society immediately. Some knowledge is meant to be preserved, but not without proper containment. The hunger waits.